What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination, where everything you think is real. I'm your host, Emma, and I am so thrilled to bring to you guys my guest of honor today, Lisa Meister. Lisa, I found through different channels of social media, just in connection with other survivors and other advocates. And her story, I feel, is really important because it brings to light a topic that I haven't touched a lot on so far in the Survivor series, which is satanic ritual abuse. And I think Lisa is amazing. She has a podcast we're going to talk about that she brings guests on also to talk about the subject in particular and to feature other survivors. And I think she's a wealth of knowledge that every single one of you listening is going to take a lot of information from, and it's going to connect a lot of dots for you like it did for me. So without further ado, Lisa, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Emma. It's quite an honor. I'm
Um,
really impressed by what you're doing. You're speaking out for SRA, and I really appreciate that.
I feel I know I was talking to you a little bit before the call, but there's something in me that after learning this information, I want to be able to do something productive with it. And I think it's important people learn. So I appreciate you being able to have the courage to step up and talk about this really hard subject. You know, a lot of podcasts and a lot of people that do talk publicly are talking about these really positive things, personal development and success and business, you know, and it has to be really challenging to talk about quite literally the worst things that a person could ever go through, and you know, your own personal traumas and hardships. So I just want to commend you also for the courage that you have to educate people like me and everybody listening.
Well, thank you. And it's not just the evil of my story that I want people to key on, it's the survival that we have inside of us and God being able to get us to the other side and to find healing and to find a way to live life and to be productive and to enjoy, which I think is the more important part of my story and what I really want to convey. I'm not a broken person. I'm not a person just trying to survive. That, it's important to live and we can all do that.
I couldn't agree more. And excuse my French, everybody, but survivors are badasses. They are, I mean, the strength that you have of what you've overcome things that have broken people, that people haven't lived through. The things that you guys have overcome are things that most people will never overcome in their life, and it's a strength that most people don't ever develop. So I think we all can take a lot and learn how to be stronger, how to be more courageous, how to have bravery, and how to kind of step into ourselves despite what we're going through, and not let that story use us, but find a really productive way to use our story. So let's get into you. I find your story, it's really traumatic and horrible, but it's like you said, I also love the fact that you're now podcasting, you're doing things with your story, you're educating people, you have children, you have grandchildren. And I would love to kind of start at the beginning and talk about your past a little bit, and we'll work to where you are now, because I think it's really inspiring how you've been able to overcome everything you've gone through.
I grew up in northern Michigan, a very remote small town. And I had a father who was a pharmacist. He had his own business. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I had a couple brothers and church-going family. We looked perfect on the outside. And it's a really important thing to understand was we had to look perfect. So my mom once said it to me beautifully. She said, the most important person in my life is Jackie Kennedy because you never knew what she was thinking. And it's like, because my mom, you never knew what she was thinking. She was very quiet. Everybody thought she was a saint because she was very quiet. And she was very much about how we looked as a family. So before you went anywhere, you were checked head to toe, how you looked, how you were going to present yourself, that you're under, your best manners. It was discussed how you were going to treat people when you were out. You were going to be very respectful. You were going to do mom and dad proud, right? So that's what I did. I went through life achieving at everything I did. I was a really hard worker. I was valedictorian in my class. I was all conference shortstop on our softball team. I was National Honor Society. I don't even remember what I was there. Secretary, I believe. I was photographer for the yearbook. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. You name it, I did it. I did really well at it. I got into top-notch school. I went to University of Michigan with scholarships and uh, graduated with distinction, and everything looked good. But at the same time, I was being satanic ritually abused by my family in a cult in the town, and it was hidden and it was repressed inside of me, which means during the day wouldn't be able to tell you that that was happening. I knew there was something wrong with me. I knew that there was something hidden. I always knew that. And like there was points in time where it would almost come out. Like there was a teacher in school that found me crying in the bathroom one morning before school started. She asked me what was wrong. And I said, my dad is just so mean. And she goes, and I didn't ask you any more questions because I thought, yeah, everybody knows your dad's mean. And she went off to teach her class. And, you know, she came to me later and she's like, Lisa, it's my fault. I should have seen it. But there was nothing to see, right? My dad was a mean, nasty person. Everybody knew that. But when you look perfect, it's hard to question. So there was like tics, like I would blink my eyes and I wouldn't be able to stop. That's a tic. So it was like emotional responses. People would see that, but they didn't know. You wouldn't know with a child what that's from. I had yeast infections constantly growing up, unexplicable. You know, I was always told that that's what the problem was. I'd wake up screaming, burning pain in the middle of the night. I'd get put into baths of, you know, oatmeal and stuff to calm it down and medicines, and it was never explained. Blood in the underwear in the morning. Oh, does this mean I've started my period? I'd show it to my mom and she'd just say no. No information given. You know, I remember talking to my mom when I was 7 saying, Dad hurts me. And she goes, oh, he's just playing with you. I said, no, down here, and pointed down to my private area. And she said, oh, he's just checking you for vaginal infections, you know, and things like that I was aware of, I remembered, but I couldn't say I'm being sexually abused, I'm being ritually abused. And that didn't come out until I was 29. So life was hard.
Touch on why that is for really young children who experience such severe trauma, why it's something that they're able to not think about or be conscious of during the times that they're not experiencing it. I think a lot of people listening and in general, that's something for them that, well, what does she mean? She didn't know that she went through it, or she wasn't aware of it. But I think you do a really great job explaining how that happens and why. So I'll let you explain that. But if you wouldn't mind just touching on that real quick, and then we'll continue on with your story.
It's a really good question. So a child has to deal with sexual abuse. So if you're getting sexually abused and then you wake up in the morning and you think, oh, wow, I was sexually abused, you're not going to be able to function. And a child has to function. So you have to go to school, you have to do work, you have to keep going. And so God creates things within our bodies to help kids to get through it, because he knew this was going to happen. So he sets up something with, especially with SRA, that's called a dissociative disorder. So in the rituals, it's like your mind kind of fragments into little pieces, and just that little piece of your mind will handle that ritual or that part of a ritual because it's too overwhelming for you. So if you're in a ritual, and let's talk about extreme pain that you're dealing with, but there's also horrific circumstances in the setup of the ritual, like maybe animals getting killed, babies getting killed, you know, blood sort of stuff. So part of you might be dealing with pain, another part of your mind is focused on dealing with that, so you don't have to deal with pain and that at exactly the same time. So your brain is splitting down into pieces to handle it, and then those pieces are stored as memories, but they're stored way far back in trauma kind of receptors in your brain. So up here where things are stored in our memory, we're thinking about it. So things in your life, can you remember what happened to you when you were 7? Probably not, but if someone, maybe your mom starts talking about a birthday party you had and starts bringing back certain reminders, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I remember that. That's kind of a good way to explain it. But because it's traumatic, it gets stored back even deeper and even farther so that you don't have to deal with it during the day. So it's kind of like a brain shut on, shut off kind of a thing that's going on with dissociation. Repression works a lot the same way. Kids that are not SRA might be SA, and they repress it completely, which means they're just not going to think about it. That means, you know, there's different parts of their brain that's working to deal with the trauma so that they can focus on school when they're in school or in different areas of their life to keep going. So it's really brilliant that our minds can do that. And I'm very grateful for that. It makes you feel crazy as an adult, you know, it really does. But it's the only way a child can get through it. Because you've got at least 18 years with your parents. And if, you're going through sexual abuse, you're going through SRA, you're going through domestic violence, whatever, you've got a lot of years to get through, and you need strategies to do it. So your body's pretty much set up to do that already, which is brilliant. Does that make
That's really
sense?
why they in the past classify it as multiple personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Before there was an understanding of how it happened, it seemed to them that there were different people living inside the same body, and they were different people versus different parts of the same person. This part, how you said, dealt with this experience or this trauma. This part dealt with that. And then there's the normal you that shows up and goes to school, and you're able to almost push back, how you said, really deep those memories and compartmentalize it, so it's not something that's interfering with your everyday life.
Right. So like the multiple personality disorder, it's unfortunate the way they make us sound like mental people, and we're not. We might have mental problems because of it. We might have borderline disorders and different things like that, because dealing with all this stuff is just very difficult. But in general, we're pretty normal people, just with a very abnormal background. So that the multiple personality makes it sound like you're just all these different people, you never knew who you are, and we don't know who's going to come out. Maybe you're going to come murder us because maybe there's a murderer inside of you, right? And that's how movies portray it and things like that, and that's not the way it is at all. But sometimes within these parts, we can make them into another child, because then in our mind, it's not happening to me, it's happening to her. And then there's that distancing. And if you can distance as a child, you will distance yourself from that abuse in every way that you can. So I was also sexually abused in my home. And I had this beautiful wallpaper on my wall with like little dolls and little girls on it. So if I was being sexually abused in the home, I could stare at that wall and kind of disappear into those little girls, and like, I'm one of them and I'm not me, right? And so you can sort of see how that would happen. In a ritual, nothing exists that's comforting that you can go into anywhere. So you go into your mind, because that's all that there is. So then you're creating, and the rituals are actually designed to force the child to do that. And that's when we get into programming, where they're trying to force the child to create. They call them altars. I really don't like that name. I think we need a different name to come up with, because they use altars, within the rituals and the ceremonies themselves. So the different parts of us.
Gosh, it's just so much information that we don't learn that I wish that we did, because it's like you said, it's really sad that psychology classified it that way for so long, because it really did a disservice for survivors who that wasn't the case. And what it was a defragmentation, like you said, and parts that needed to come back together to make a whole and to figure out what part of the whole they were versus thinking that they're separate.
Right. So like for me, a pain part is if I get into pain, I can handle great amounts of pain. I had 4 kids without any epidurals, because I can go into part of me and you just handle it because that's what you have to do. I had lung surgery a few years ago, and they had overdosed me somehow with the button, the pain reliever button, and they had overdosed me. So I was like only breathing a few times per second. So then I was afraid to push the button because they didn't explain to me that it's okay now, we fixed it. So I went without any pain meds for a while until I was panting. And they're like, why are you panting? You need to be pushing your button. So like the pain part of me can handle that. I can get into that mode, and you can't talk to me. I will be blank in my eyes, but it's because the pain part's coming forward and it's handling it. So it's like strengths really in a lot of ways. So we talk about integration of parts, whereas we heal, we want to not be fragmented anymore, but for our mind to be open, neurons firing without having to go around all these memories and all these things. So for me, it's like I want that strength to be able to handle pain as just part of a normal part of me, and not a part I have to dissociated part where I'm going to be, blank and staring while I'm handling it. Because as an adult, dissociation is dangerous. It's our response as a child because we can't get out of the suffering we're doing. In a ritual, you can't leave, you can't make a decision that will get you out of what's happening to you. But as an adult, if I dissociate, then I am stuck, and anybody could come and do me harm, and I'm just going to be there and take it, which is not safe as an adult. As an adult, you want all your faculties about you so that you can handle and strategize any kind of enemy that's coming at you and get yourself out. So what works as a child doesn't work as an adult, which also makes healing more difficult because the dissociation that worked to help you get through a lot of the pain and suffering as a child, and then you didn't deal with all the emotional fallouts because everything was fragmented, then you're dealing with all that emotional fallout, but you don't have the fragmentation anymore and you can't dissociate to deal with it. So then you feel like I'm dealing with all this pain all over again like I did as a child, but now I have no tools to get me through it. Now what do I do? And that's where a lot of survivors really fall apart and get into drugs and alcohol and addictions, or they can't hold down jobs, and a lot of times they even end up homeless or in mental institutions, and it's just a big problem. So dealing with SRA and dealing with dissociation, there's just so many aspects to it that's complicated, as what's great as a child, not so great as an adult, and vice versa. It's difficult.
I can't imagine. What age were you when you started to become aware of some of these parts of yourself or some of these memories that you had repressed for so long?
I was 29. So I went away to college at 18. I graduated at 22, got married at 22. And so then I was away from my family. And my husband is wonderful. He's not SRA. A lot of times survivors marry into another family of SRA, and then it's generational, and then your kids are going to be in it, and it's just a mess. But I was blessed. My husband is not, and he was very supportive through the whole thing. So we got married, and I was teaching for a couple of years, and we started having kids, and we ended up having 4. And I just kept like emotionally falling apart. Like I couldn't seem to keep a house. It's like I just couldn't seem to think. I couldn't seem to function, and I seemed to be getting less functional as time was going on, and I couldn't figure it out. here I was smart, right? I was valedictorian. I went to University of Michigan, graduated with distinction. I'm a teacher. My husband's a professor. It's like, it's not that I'm not smart. So what is going on? And literally nothing was coming. It was just, my mind was blank. I couldn't have told you even then that I'm a sexual abuse survivor or I'm an SRA survivor. So when I was 29, I had a good friend of mine pregnant with twins, and she had such severe postpartum depression after that. Once the babies were born, she just completely lost it. She said, like, I would hear a baby crying and I didn't know what to do. She'd already had a couple kids before, but she didn't remember about changing diapers, and she didn't know how to feed them. And she said, I get in a shower and I didn't know what I was supposed to do in the shower. So it turned out she had been sexually abused. So I watched her newborn twins for a couple weeks while she went into got some deep therapy, and miraculously within 2 weeks she got better. And my mother-in-law, who was very sweet, was helping her through that. So I said, well, I don't really know anything about sexual abuse. She goes, well, here's a little pamphlet on it. So it's like, okay, I'll read it because I'm just kind of interested in what it is. And I was reading it, and it's like, oh no. And I got really angry and I threw the pamphlet across the room, and it's like, this is stupid. Because it was reading me, okay? And I knew that. And it's like, but I'm not sexually abused. That makes no sense. So that was November and December that I had the twins. And then we had my family in for dinner in the end of January. So they lived a couple hours away. It didn't happen real often. And while they were at our house, just a normal kind of day, my dad was nasty as normal. And he built a tent in the living room. So I had a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at the time. And he let my 5-year-old daughter in, and he wouldn't let my 3-year-old son in. He just kept pushing him out, saying, you're just going to wreck it. And my son's crying. And, it just made no sense. It's like, this is just nasty. And I could see in the tent, so he wasn't touching her inappropriately. Nothing like that happened. And then at the end of dinner, I had made carrot cake for dessert with this cream cheese icing on the top. And my 5-year-old daughter was just eating the icing. And my husband said, I need you to eat the cake with your icing. So my father immediately took a huge scoop of icing off of his cake, put it in my daughter's mouth as he was glaring at my husband. And that's all that happened. It was like, whoa, that's terrible, right? But not crazy terrible. So they left. I got my kids to bed, and I was falling to pieces, just falling to pieces. So I always would take my angst out on the floor, hands and knees, scrubbing the linoleum in the kitchen. So my husband knows that. So he comes out, he's like, whoa. And he's very understated, very calm. So Lisa, what's going on? And all I could come up with was, he's buddying up to her. He's buddying up to her, and you can't let him. And he's like, okay, who's buddying up to whom? Like, he just really had no idea what was going on. And it's like, my father's buddying up to our daughter, don't let him. You can't let him. Don't let him. He's like, okay, what's he going to do? And I just felt crestfallen. It's like, I don't know. And then that night started nightmares, many times a night, every night, of multiple groups of men raping me. It was just awful. And after about 2 weeks of that, I had my first flashback. And it was like, we were getting ready for bed. I was awake. Had never been in therapy, so it wasn't like a counselor put it in my mind or anything. And all of a sudden there was, like a male thing on my face, and I'm just like slapping my face and screaming. And, Patrick's like, whoa, what's going on? And I just like, I can't get it off. And you could feel it, and just the terror and he's calm me down and held me and soothed me. And so by the time he calmed down, I said, I would never accuse somebody of something because I didn't see a face. I would never accuse somebody of something if I didn't see a face with it. But everything inside of me says it's my dad, and my mom knows. And then it was a very long process. I mean, for a long time, I couldn't even remember what my dad looked like. It's like if I'd seen him on the street, I wouldn't have been able to recognize him because everything just blanked. And, your mind is just racing in all these different directions, and your heart is pounding, and you do feel like you're going crazy. And it was like 9 months of sexual abuse information that just kept coming, of my dad doing things to me in the home from the time I was very young until, I don't even know how old I was. I think I remember him making, the last one was like an audio kind of a memory of him saying, "You'll never belong to your Patrick, my husband, you'll always belong to me." So, I mean, I married at 22, so it went on a very long time. So then 9 months in, it just kept getting worse. Like I would have predicted that as I was accepting that this is true, this is what happened to me, that I should be getting better. But instead, I was very fast getting worse. I was unable to function. I was unable to care for my kids. And we went to clinic, an outpatient clinics that was a Christian psychology sort of a place. And there was a real sweet psychiatrist there who was very, very helpful to me and kind of gave me some, I guess the biggest nugget from him was I wasn't going crazy, because it's like, I'm going crazy. And he said, "Lisa, people that are going crazy don't know that they're going crazy," which was a huge relief to me, because I was convinced that that's what was going on, because it's like, there's no way I wouldn't know if I'd been sexually abused all those years ago. But then everything started making sense, right? The blood in the underwear, telling my mom my father was hurting me, and, all those yeast infections and all that sort of stuff. And so 9 months in then is when ritual sort of memories started coming out. And that's when the satanic ritual stuff started presenting, people in robes, masks, like hoods covering their face. You couldn't see people at all underneath it, chanting, candles, bonfires, blood, dead animals, just being tied down. That stuff started coming out. So again, here I go. Now I've really lost it. I'm really crazy. So thank God my husband.
To your parents at this point?
We had gone to speak to them about the sexual abuse, and they denied everything. There's no way, we'd never have done that to you. You're crazy. And then at one point, because I got really angry, I had notes of things I wanted to make sure I said to them. So I had some papers in my hand. And my dad looked at me and he smirked. And he said something about, "And as you said, I molested you." And he smirked at me. And I got so mad. So I am a very quiet person in general. And I've never stood up to my dad ever, because you just didn't. And I hit the papers really hard on the end table. And I said, "Don't you call it molest. You call it what it was. You raped me." And he started coming out the chair at me, and Patrick jumped in the center, and, it was like, he knew, right? He knew. I was calling him, I was saying, "I know what you did." And there had been some phone calls with my mom before that even happened. And she knew something was up. She's like, "Lisa, what's going on?" And it's like, "I'm just dealing with some stuff I hadn't dealt with before." And she goes, "It never happened." I'm like, "What never happened?" And she goes, "You can't think about it. You just have to go on. You don't want your kids taken away from you," which is an SRA threat. Later, you find out that, when the SRA stuff started coming in, it took me a lot of years to put that together, but that's a lot of the SRA thing. "We will take your kids from you." They say that to the moms, when mom's not SRA and their kids are disclosing, "We'll take the kids away from you if you say anything to anybody." it's a big threat that they have. So, she was trying to get me back into repression, to keep me quiet. So they did not like us standing up to them. And a lot of it goes because my husband was right there with me, strengthening me, going with me, supporting me. Whatever I decided we needed to do, he would be right there with me, helping me to do it, which is amazing because most survivors don't get that.
Well, and that had to have been really hard for him because he met you and you weren't aware of these things. And then
Right.
all of a sudden they start coming out. I think on his perspective, it would have been really easy for him too to classify you as going crazy. And I think that's amazing that we have strong men, and hopefully that gives hope to other survivors and people listening to this, that there are people who care and who will listen. And those are the people that we need to start bringing together and bringing closer to survivors and to these stories.
Yeah. I think the strong spouses really need to stand up and speak and teach other people how to support their spouse through this, because really it was 20 years of agony for him, watching me suffer and go through what I was going through, and health falls apart, and it's like one issue after another, and remembering comes in waves, so you have all these flashbacks and you're trying to deal with it before the next one comes, and then you might get a little bit of break, and then it starts all over again, a whole new wave of flashbacks. So you're going into therapy, you're going out of therapy, and you're just in for a crazy roller coaster ride that nobody wants to be on. And then there's the whole secondary trauma aspect of things, where somebody who did not live through the trauma is traumatized hearing about the other person's trauma. So for Patrick and my kids, that was a very difficult part of their lives and stuff that they still deal with today. Even one of my therapists, she's sweet, just really helpful to me. And she did a lot of EMDR, which is it's moving your memories from like the deep parts of the recesses where they're hidden and fragmented, moving them to your frontal cortex so you can think through them. And then it's kind of desensitizing yourself so that you can actually think through it without emotionally falling apart. So it's a really big process, and you have to go through the memories themselves to do it. So she absorbed the memories as I was speaking them, and then she had to go get therapy for the secondary trauma she had just hearing what happened to me. So that's another hard part for survivors too. Like speaking today is knowing that there's this line of what you can say and what you don't want to say, because you want to say enough for people to get the scope and to kind of understand what we're talking about, but not so much that you really overwhelm people, terrify them, and give them secondary trauma in the process. And I know that that's a really big concern for a lot of survivors. I mean, sexual abuse is horrific. And then you add satanic ritual to to sexual type abuses, and it is horrifying. It's
And
very
these
scary
people,
stuff.
psychologists either are equipped to know. They don't get taught about these things either, just like we don't in our lives. That's not a normal conversation or something that comes up in school that you're made aware of, or something that your parents even know exists to teach you about. And so that has to be really hard also, like you said, for survivors who want to go get therapy, because this isn't even in most arsenals that most psychologists and psychotherapists learn about whenever they're going to school to help people.
Right. And then there's also for a cult to protect itself. So you've got all these kids that you're abusing. You got to make sure that they all stay quiet throughout their lives, because you can't allow this to get out. So they also will plant therapists that are cult active therapists who will, make things more difficult. Like I was talking to a survivor the other day, she was going for therapy and then finally realized her therapist was cult active because he had accidentally mentioned where he lived, which was a compound where she was abused. And she's like, he's part of the cult. I had no idea. She hadn't noticed him there. So like they will plant them, doctors the same way, lawyers, judges, and then people go, oh, you're one of those conspiracy theorists, right? And they'll smile at you. Ah, yeah. But if you think about the mafia, everybody knows the mafia exists. The mafia had lawyers and judges in their pockets. They had senators to get them out of trouble, to keep quiet what they were doing, to cover things up, police officers. It's the same sort of idea as the cult. So that's not a conspiracy theory if we're talking about the mafia, right? But if you put satanic ritual abuse in it, oh, you're one of those. Or some troll said it on one of my sites. Oh, don't you know they debunked that in the 80s? It's like, well, no, because they didn't. It was discussed in the 80s, and they just, you get people that will just come out false memory syndrome, which is not even a syndrome. It's not even a thing. And it was created by people that were cult active people. And then people will just quote, oh, come on, that's a false memory. No, that's what really happened. So that's why, your podcast is so important, because when you start hearing survivors saying, this happened to me, you can't say it's a conspiracy theory. You can't say it's a false memory syndrome. You're like, look, there's a preponderance of evidence in that it happened to many people. So if you go to the Catholic Church in Boston with the whole Boston Globe, when they did an expose on the Catholic Church moving pedophilia priests around. So they were abusing children, and when they would hear about it, they just moved the priest to another parish where he'd abuse more children. For a lot of years, there'd been a lot of rumblings about that. A lot of kids were getting abused by, or like punished by their parents. How dare you say that about the priest, right? But finally, the preponderance of evidence was such, there were so many kids saying this, or adults saying as a child, the same stories, the same priests. And then the Boston Globe was able to go figure out how the priests got switched around. And then they were able to prove that it was true. There's a preponderance of evidence that backed up, oh yeah, Catholic priests are doing that, and they're doing it in large numbers, and the Catholic Church knows, and they're hiding it, not a conspiracy. So with survivors being courageous enough to speak out, it's like, okay, this isn't a conspiracy. This is a bunch of people from around the world that have the exact same stories. And there's no way they could have the exact sort of stories unless it's really happening.
I think that's really important, because that's something that for me was hard to understand too whenever I first started learning about a lot of this. And I'd hear that it wasn't true. So I'm in that gray area where I'm trying to do independent research, but there's all this information against it saying, no, 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 no. But you look at a survivor like you, and then a survivor, for example, Brooke Federline, who I've had on here, she lives in New Zealand and has gone through satanic ritual abuse. And she says a lot of the same information that I've heard on your podcast, and she doesn't know any of you, right? So again, how do all these people that have been silenced, so your stories aren't able to get out to educate people. Most people don't know about this, but your memories are very not identical, because there's a lot of differences that happen, occult or this or that. There's a lot of differences, but a lot of parallels as to what you go through and what these people have subjected these children to. So if you wouldn't mind, would you be able to give some context into cults and what exactly satanic ritual abuse is? I think this is something you talk about very eloquently and in a way that really helps people like me and people listening to understand. There's little bits and pieces of it, and we hear those terms thrown around, but if you haven't ever gone through it, if it's not something that you've learned about actively, even that can be really hard to almost convince yourself in your mind that this is real, because it seems so outrageous, and that it just, how can that possibly exist, and how was I never made aware of it? But like you said, it's very undercover, just like how a mafia would be, to where you might hear whistleblowers, or there might be random little bits of information, or somebody might get arrested once in a while, or one little piece of it might get exposed. but the information is still kept very quiet. And I think a lot of people still, they hear satanic ritual abuse and they say, okay, I'm hearing that, but gosh, what is it? I can't even fathom what that is. Would you be able to give some context to that? And even if you have examples from what other guests on your podcast, and you guys listening, I'm going to link Lisa's podcast below, but she features a lot of satanic ritual abuse survivors who really help you understand what exactly it is that they go through and the parallels again in all their stories. It's not a conspiracy theory, and it's something I think we all need to have in our arsenal, even if we say to ourselves, well, that doesn't affect me. It's not something I'm going through. You may know somebody who is going through it and you have no idea. If you're a therapist, you may have somebody that walks into your office talking to you about it. You might find signs if you're a teacher at school from a child who has experienced or who is going through this. Again, Lisa's family, like that, it's so important for people to understand that pedophiles, occult members, satanic ritual abusers, there's no one profile that these people have. A lot of people who are participating in these horrible crimes against children are very normal, successful, charming people that are very highly esteemed in society, and they look totally normal from the outside. They have a job, they have friends, they go out and do things, they are active members in the community, they have children, they have a wife, right? And it's so important for people to understand that this is happening, and it's not just some stereotypical person that you might see on the news, some crackhead looking person that happened to kidnap a kid or abuse them. These are people that people would see it in public and say, gosh, what a great parent. Look at that kid. She's accelerating in school. She is getting all A pluses. She is on the honor roll. She's valedictorian. The father owns a business, right? There's a lot of misperceptions that people have as to who is actually involved with this. So I know I just said a lot, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about satanic ritual abuse and just cults in general and what they entail.
So it's very complicated, but I'm an elementary school teacher, so I believe in making things as understandable as possible. So I've tried to come up with a best kind of a definition. So my best definition that I can come up with for satanic ritual abuse is an extremely sadistic, psychological, emotional, spiritual, sexual, physical torture of children through a ceremony where the devil, Satan, is worshipped through blaspheming God by mocking the death and resurrection of Jesus. So there's a lot to that. So he's like, oh, come on, that's the best you can come up with. Okay, that's seriously the baseline of what it is. So let me unpack it a little bit for you. The amount of abuse that's going on in the child, it's definitely physical. There's a lot of pain going on. There is sleep deprivation. There's drugs being used in the child. My dad was the pharmacist in the group. There's drugs available. There's doctors in the group. They fix you up at the end. I remember one time they said, you went too far. You can't go this far next time, because he had to make you look good so you could go back home, get up the next day, go to school, or whatever you needed to do. Sexual, it's pedophilia, right? It's sex trafficking. The child will be sexually abused by a lot of people within each ritual. It is, it's very psychological, because you think about a horror flick, which I do not watch, but if you think of a horror story, a film, and you think of how terrifying they are, multiply that by 100 and put it on a child, that happening to a child. So you can imagine psychologically, this child is splitting, right? We're fracturing in our mind so we can deal with the different parts of it. Everything's coming at our face. We're dealing with what's right in front of us because things are coming fast and it's coming quickly. They use the iconography of the church. It's all, and to understand okay, come on, you're talking about the devil, you're talking about Satan, you're talking about God and the church and Jesus, but you have to understand that everybody that's at this ritual knows that that Satan exists and the demonic is real, because you are seeing demonic manifestations, you are hearing demonic voices, you're seeing things like levitating up into the air. There's definitely things that cannot be explained in any non-demonic context. And they're doing it all in mockery of Jesus. So you have a Bible, you have the altar, right? So they have the high priest, which is a witch or a warlock running the whole show. There's blood, there's buckets of blood everywhere. They get them from funeral homes. You can get lots and lots of blood unexplained from a funeral home, right? No one's going to question that goes missing. So, I mean, just as a child, there just always was. In everything they did, there was just, I mean, just a staggering amount of blood. I mean, it was just very overwhelming. There's animals getting killed. There's babies that are killed. There's older kids that are killed, and they, the foster system. There's kids that go missing every year that are never accounted for. They are never found. Those are the kids that are getting killed in these rituals. As a teen, they have you give birth to babies that are very young. They're not full term, and then they force you to kill them. So there's a lot of children that's happening to. So they use children because Jesus was the Son of God, and he was sent to be sacrificed once for everybody so that nobody else had to have a sacrifice anymore. So in the satanic opposite, because the satanic is always going in the opposite direction of what God is doing, they're mocking it by, oh, you're going to give your only son. Well, you watch, we'll get parents to give their kids over and over and over again. So that's mocking their Jesus. The blood of Jesus, they mock it with using buckets and buckets of blood. They use the Bible. They'll have somebody dressed up as fake Jesus walking around, and kids don't know. They think it's the real Jesus, and then he'll come and rape them as part of what's going on. So an interesting thing is there was a pastor that talked to me, and he had gone to my father to minister to him. And my father said to him, I know the devil has power. Can you prove to me God has more power? And that's really, really telling, because in these cult families, they're doing this for power. They give their children and they participate in these rituals, and in return, they get money. They get position in society, like whatever their group is. Like, we had a small town. My dad was appointed to the school board without an election. It's like crazy. And my dad was able to come up with a loan for a business that never should have made it. We had a very small town. He was the third pharmacy in a town that couldn't support two. So he got position, he got money to start his pharmacy. He was given patients to come to his pharmacy, so cult people would go to his, it's just, when he sold his business, he got $60,000 for it. So it was not a big business, right? But he retired at the age of 50 to a really nice house. And like, they go to Florida every year for a few weeks. I mean, they bought brand new furniture. Like, all of a sudden they were rich. It's like, well, where did the money come from? Because it certainly wasn't from your pharmacy. So they get money and wealth through this as well. And it's interesting because the devil will give power, and he will give money, and he will give authority in the communities, and whatever person wants, they get the connections going, kind of like fraternities in college. The guys like to do that because they have their brotherhood, right? So they have their friends they can hang with, and then later in life, they've got people to do business dealings with and help them to work things out. Same sort of thing goes on in these groups. So there's this community that they have, and they work together to do all these things. So if you start looking at the pieces of it, it makes sense, but only if you understand that it's all about power, the devil will give them that power. But God, the way he works is he's the creator of life, and he wants to heal, and he wants to deliver us and set us free, which is what he's done with me. But it's not like the outward stuff that the devil's doing. So my dad wanted outward power, he wanted money, and he got that. I don't want that. I saw that as a very young child. I wanted nothing to do with what they were doing. I didn't care what they had to offer. I wasn't going to take it. I wanted what God had to offer. He had love, forgiveness, deliverance, healing, and he brings joy. Like my dad was never joyful. Nobody would ever say that my dad was ever happy. He was miserable. Doing this ritual stuff does not bring them happiness and fulfillment in life. It really makes them miserable. So, like, if you look at Hitler, he was somebody that believed in the occult and he followed it. And that's where you start getting into MK Ultra sort of stuff, because he recognized that the child is like kind of like a conduit to the spiritual realm. So if they abuse a child, they can get demonic power into that child. And then whoever rapes that child gets this demonic power. So then they take that into labs and they're doing the same sort of stuff. And they realize that they can put all these suggestions and the bits and pieces in the dark recesses of these child's mind. And then they can get these kids that are dissociated. And so then if we program into them certain words that might be innocuous, we can get certain behaviors and get cult predictable behaviors from them when we say these words to them. So if you get the whole Jason Bourne series on, you watch the movies, that sort of idea, he couldn't explain why he was doing what he did or how he got to where he was. And he was trying to understand what had happened to him, what was stuff that happened to him in labs. And it's the same sort of thing that the MK Ultra is, which we know is through the CIA. And, we've documented that, yes, they actually did these sorts of things. So they were coming in on what SRA was doing and using the same sorts of things. So like I was talking to a woman the other day, and she said her ex, who has custody of her child, because the courts are taking away children from moms who are not SRA active and giving them to the dads. But this mom was an SRA survivor herself. And she's like, I realized every time I talked to him afterwards, I was completely dissociated for days. And then she realized that there's one word that he would use over and over again. And she goes, like, one time it was now. He just kept saying the word now over and over, and it made no sense. So because she started recording. And then she started figuring out, hey, I've got programming with these words. And then she had to start working on breaking the programming. So it's very deep stuff that they understand. They're connected and they can work through these things with children on a spiritual level. And then they can do it in labs and recreate that sort of stuff as well. So it's really sinister.
It really is. I'm interestingly, years ago, for my own personal development, I wanted to learn about hypnotism and neuro-linguistic programming because I heard that that's something that is always influencing our behavior, whether it's through the media or there's ways that it subtly influences society, and how there's these different sciences that people know that they apply it to whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's marketing, whether it's a speech, whether it's even presidential candidacies and their campaigns and the words that they use around it. And I got really fascinated in it and wanted to go learn more. And one of the things that we learned was there's an imprint period on a child from age 1 to 7, where their brainwave frequency is in a state where as an adult, it would almost be as if we were getting close to sleeping. Or say you're watching TV and you completely zone out, you're conscious, but somebody could call your name 4 times and you're just super into the TV, just staring with a blank face, and you don't hear the person's name or calling your name. And let's just say they call it 3 times and all of a sudden oh, sorry, what was that? And they're like, bro, I've been calling you 3 times. You couldn't hear me? And you're like, no, weirdly, I couldn't. I was so engrossed in the TV, right? And so hypnotism is used all over, and children especially, they live in almost a state that makes them especially susceptible to hypnotism because their brainwave frequency is in the same frequency that as adults, a hypnotherapist would try to put you into to help you be more active with getting suggestions into your brain. If you guys hear some digging,
Wow.
my little puppy's digging, but I'm finding learning about survivors that a lot of what I learned was framed very positively of how to use it to empower yourself with information, how to break your own programming with what things that you see on TV or what to say before you watch a movie or what to be conscious of and how to interpret language that's thrown at you from people and to actually be able to use discernment instead of just hearing something. But hearing what you say, and I've heard this from so many survivors, that it's really that period between 1 and 5 years old that children are most easily programmed through these ritual abuses. And so I want people to understand that that period of your life, like you said, could you go back to your life and think about age 7 and remembering something? A normal child, anyways, as an adult looking back, you say, gosh, I don't remember being 2 years old. I don't remember being 1. I don't remember being 3 or even 7 or 10. Right. And to think about going through these horrific things before you're even done developing and before your frequency raises into what we know now as an adult and how we can consciously see the world. I can't imagine trying to unpack that yourself and having all of that come out and recognizing that, right? But it just goes to show what you said. It's very strategic. This is science that's been known for a very long time. The problem is they've really erased it from our history and they put a date on it and said, during this year, we stopped it. We knew that it was happening. We dabbled in it a little bit, but CIA doesn't use it anymore. It's something buried, nothing on it anymore. You don't have to worry about it. And what most people don't realize is it's very heavily used now. It's used in these cults with children, and in much smaller ways, it's used with us as adults, whether it is we're watching TV and we get hypnotized and or we see an ad and we end up unconsciously buying that item whenever we go to the grocery store. There's so many ways that mind control is used to disempower us, and we're so indoctrinated with not recognizing that, and we fall for it as adults. So I just want people to put yourselves in your child's mind and just imagine having to go through these horrific things and then what that would be like to unpack that as an adult. And like you said, it's these are very prevalent people. They are strategically placed in places. Like your dad was a pharmacist, and on the outside, he's helping people get their prescriptions, but behind the scenes, he's drugging children, right? And it's nothing is really how we grew up for it to think about. And I want people listening to just wrap your mind around thinking about people that you deal with every day and how it might not be the person that you deal with or that you see at the pharmacy or that you see as a doctor or a lawyer, but understand that this is very prevalent and people know and understand the science so well and they use it against you. They use it against children. And it's very, very, very intentional and it works. It's very, very crystal clear on how to do it and the fact that it works. Now for you, how when those memories started surfacing, how did you manage to I don't even want to say cope with it because I don't think it's not you have to cope with it. There's not a choice, but how did you end up finding the courage to talk about it or to even confront your parents or to talk to your husband about it or your kids? What was going through your mind as you were managing and dealing with all of these emotions, all of these memories that were surfacing?
Right. Well, my husband was there with the first flashback. So there wasn't any way to hide it from him. You know, he was right there. He was absorbing the information with me. And like the flashbacks aren't like, you know, a lot of people think you're just sleeping and you have nightmare or something. You say, "Oh, that must have happened to me." That was not my experience. It was I was awake. It was as if it was happening right there. You could feel it. You could smell it. It was painful. And then, like with SRA, those flashbacks, seriously, for like 2 weeks before the flashback would hit, I would get this incredible pain somewhere that was inexplicable. And it was painful. And just trying to survive. And then I would have a flashback would just hit with this bizarre set of circumstances of what happened in the ritual. While I was awake, the flashback would hit, and it would perfectly hit why the pain was where it was and in the way it was. Like I had this even like a vaginal ring of burning inside that made no sense. It's like, that's just really weird. And then there was a flashback. I was in northern Michigan, so it was a winter, and they broke an icicle off the roof and used the inverted end and stuck it inside. And it's like, it was burning the inside of me. It was freezing me. That's what, it's like, that's too bizarre. I mean, to have that pain and then that fit it. There was no way that your body could be making it up and then come up with some kind of a scenario to fit it. So Patrick, explaining those to him, I couldn't speak them out. So as I was having these flashbacks, it would be like crying, yelling, screaming sort of stuff going on. And I wouldn't be able to say, like I'd just be stuttering. I couldn't come up with words. But so eventually I would write them down and then he would read them. And it would take a few years before I could even talk about it with a counselor. And then it was the EMDR that would help me to cycle through it, to get to the point of falling over myself and stuttering and not being able to come up with words, to be able to logically talk through it at the end without falling to pieces. So it was a very, very long, very difficult process. And thankfully, Patrick and I had promised each other before we got married that divorce would never be an option for us. So knowing that he wasn't going to leave me was very helpful in the process. And I was worried that he would leave me emotionally, and I would have understood that, because that's too much for anybody, but he didn't even do that. It certainly made marriage difficult, but he stuck right there with me all the time. And he's always been nothing but right there, encouraging me and helping me. So I was 29 when the memory started. I'm 51 now. So the first 12 years, maybe, I never spoke to a therapist who'd ever worked with another survivor before. So I was first one for them. They believed me, helped me through it, but they had never met anybody. So they didn't have information of how to help me. I wasn't able to find books on it. I didn't have the internet to go to, that sort of thing. And so it's pretty much on my own. So it was therapists helping me with EMDR and that sort of thing, which was very helpful. And then a lot of time with God, and God walking me through things and helping me through it. And then finally I got desperate enough to get on the internet and try a group for SRA survivors. And it was terrifying, because there are programming that you never tell. And if you do ever tell, you have to kill yourself, and this is how you do it. So like for me, there was a grave, and very deep down in the grave was a girl. She looked like a teenager, which I was at the time. And she looked like her body was broken, like she was dead in the bottom of this grave. And they said she told. So there was a group around me, all in their cloaks and all their things. So I'm looking down, they said she told, this girl looks dead. And then a big knife was put in my hand, and I was showed how to put it up under my collar, or up under my ribs, and go up and to get my heart. This is how you kill yourself if you ever tell. So everybody has a stay silent ritual that they have to go through, and this is how you will kill yourself. So for a survivor to ever tell is a really big deal. So for me to go on to the first site for survivors was terrifying, because if I tell, I have to kill myself. And then What if it's not really SRA survivors, but it's actually cult active people? Very terrifying, but I was so desperate at that point that I took the leap to do that. And it was actually through talking to other survivors that I really started to heal a lot faster. Finding out that the most shameful for me memories that I had, everybody, like I would write it and other people going, oh yeah, that happened to me. And they'd go off on how that similar thing happened to them. And it like just blew my mind. You've got to be kidding me, because you feel all alone. And to find out that other people survived it also, I just can't tell you how helpful that was. So so then it was a few more years, and I really felt like God was impressing me to write my story. It's like, wow, okay, I like to write, so that's not a problem with that. But like SRA is not a chronological story, really, because like 29 is where I started remembering. So it's like always going back and forth on your timeline to try to figure things out. I'm still putting things together to this day. So it took me several years just to come with a starting point for my book. So I started it with the dinner with my parents coming when he built the tent with my daughter and he did the icing sort of thing, because that's to me what started the memories coming out. And then I went back to my perfect childhood, and because I made it a fairy tale, I felt like my childhood was perfect. I had the perfect Christian family, and then that had to all break down through the years for me to be able to get into the memories. So in 2017 I finished my book and I published it, and I ended up in my bathroom with a knife because the programming hadn't broken down all the way yet. I hadn't anticipated that. So it's like God stopped me. He's like, Lisa, and I'm like, like almost an audible voice sort of a deal, just kind of stopping me. It's like, okay, no, I don't want to do this. And my husband came in, and it was very terrifying for my family. Obviously, my kids to this day hate my book. They don't want to hear anything about it because of how traumatizing, that was. But I got it out, and it was very important to me to put my real name on it, because I wanted to send a message that I'm not afraid of you anymore. Like what you did to me, I was a child, but I'm an adult now, and I have faculties and I have people around me that can protect me and keep me safe. And I'm not going to go in fear any longer. And I wanted other survivors to know we don't have to be afraid anymore. We're not kids, we're adults, we can do this. And then this year it was starting the podcast. So the vision I feel like God's given me is that we need to educate society to know about the existence of SRA, because there's kids that are still being abused, and we can't stop it if we can't get society to accept that it happens. So I'm talking, since I put the book out, I've been contacted by survivors around the world, which is just so sad to me. It's not an America problem. It's really worldwide. And they get told that they're making it up. I've had survivors tell me I had no idea that this was a real thing. I thought it was crazy. I had a mom who was listening, and her kids had been taken away from her, and she didn't realize that there really was such a thing as SRA, but her kids were disclosing SRA to her before they got taken away. So like, we have to help survivors. We have to legitimize, yes, this happened to you. I am so sorry this happened to you. And that's why I love watching your podcast, Emma, is sometimes you're crying when you're listening to survivors tell their story. And that means so much to us, because SRA survivors are generally met with distrust, distaste, people thinking you're disgusting. It's like, just shut up. I don't want to hear anything you have to say. And for you to show your reaction that you care and that you want to come alongside us and help us, I cannot tell you, that's something we don't get. And you're giving something. I know, and it's you're giving something to us that we do not get in society. And you're modeling this, not just for other people who aren't survivors, but you're modeling it to survivors. And that's you saying, you matter, because we don't feel like anybody cares. We don't feel like we're seen. So I thank you for doing that. And I think that your listeners who are listening to this and absorbing this information and are willing to go into it with us, because we need to do it to help survivors to heal, but especially to get out the kids that are going through it now, because you can bet it's going on, and it's going on in every community. Emma, this is not just a city here and there. It's going on all over the place because it works for them. And that's scary. That is really, really scary. But the more survivors that you're hearing from, I cannot tell you how many survivors I'm getting contacted by. And most of them can't talk and they can't share. But there are a lot of them that are able to stand up. So the ones that can are speaking for all the ones that can't. But we're going to get those kids, and we're going to get them out, and we're going to save them, and we're going to stop this, because it's time for it to be exposed. And this is how we're exposing it. One story at a time, one podcast at a time, one YouTube channel at a time.
And it really is time for the public to accept it. It's hard listening to this stuff. It's hard talking about it. And trust me, I know I've gotten a lot of hate that's come my way just from talking about it. I know it can be hard to get out in public in any way, shape, or form and even entertain that this is happening. But just like any idea that we now talk about freely, at one time it was new information, and it took talking about it over and over and over again for it to become a regular conversation. And I feel that this can be that. We can make this an everyday conversation that people freely have, that they accept and understand. And I appreciate you breaking it down the way that you do. I think the way that people interpret it just from the little bits and pieces they get, it can be really easy in your head to use discernment with it and to say, that just sounds so outrageous. How can that be true? But when you actually hear it, you start to think, that doesn't sound too out there. Like, what they're doing is absolutely unspeakable. But in the context that you put it, why couldn't it happen? And it makes perfect sense how they get away with it. We think about religious and get-togethers and worship. We picture a church where people, they do it and it's not something they're hiding behind the scenes. And we have to understand that this is opposite, like what you said. It's two different polarities. This isn't people congregating in a public space and making it known. This is this very hush hush thing that happens on private property, usually away from anybody that could hear, even the loudest scream. And it's happening in people's homes and in their communities. It's not happening in the public eye. And I think that that's what we really have to be aware of. Because like you said, this could be happening in your own neighborhood. The pharmacist that you know and you talk to every day could be involved somehow, and we need to start looking at those things, because the more we just turn a blind eye to it, the longer that we prolong these children from being saved, and it's so horrific to think about adults like you having to have lived through what you did. And if there's anything that we can do better in the future, it's to give the kids of the future a better future themselves. And I think having these conversations regularly is the first place to do it, because then we learn how to impact our children and to give them age appropriate information. We learn how to keep an eye on other people's children. We learn as teachers and providers and even lawyers and people in these systems how to find perpetrators and how to bring light to it and how to step up. And one question I want to ask you that you ask people on your podcast, and I was really curious to hear your answer, is I don't think it's any coincidence that 100% of survivors that I've personally brought on this podcast and that I've met, 100% of them have an extremely strong faith in God or whatever it is that brings them to the light. But the process of getting there, I think, is very different for people, to where if you can't even trust your own parents, you can't trust your own friends, you can't trust your own mom, you can't trust people in your community. How do you trust God? And how could God just sit by idly and watch this happen? And I think it helps hearing it from you, having a strong faith. How can other survivors and other people who have dealt with any type of trauma get closer to God, and what brought you to God? Where was God while you were going through this, and how did you end up building a relationship with him after everything that you went through?
It's a really good question. And for me, it was very simple because I was at what I see as like the throne of Satan. That's what the ritual is. That's where on earth Satan has the most power, is where these rituals are going on. I saw so much nastiness. So the Bible in John 10:10 says that the thief, which is Satan, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. So everything that I saw was killing, stealing, and destroying. And that will explain exactly what rituals are. I knew I wanted nothing to do with that. I couldn't line up with them. I would have been in a lot less pain and suffering if I had. I couldn't do it. And then when I was 7, that pastor that went to my dad, and my dad said, I know the devil has power, prove to me that God has more. Well, we went to his church for 7 years, and it was a Bible believing church. And I got introduced to the God of the Bible and to Jesus there. And the other half of John 10:10 says, but and it's talking about Jesus, I have come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. And that's what I was learning about there, is God is about love, and he's about healing, and he's about setting me free, and he wants me to have joy. He wants me to look at his creation and go, oh wow, isn't that beautiful? Like my husband and I love breakfast. We have coffee on the porch in the morning. In fact, for Mother's Day, I got 2 new porch chairs because that's my favorite place to be. And we watch the sun come up because we're very early risers. And I love to philosophize about life and looking at the sun over the retention pond that we're on. And, you know, we've got a red or a blue heron that comes that I've named Harry, and we get to see Harry come. And, you know, those are things that God created. And so God is about the good things. The devil is about destruction. So when you see nasty things going on, that's the devil. So where was God in the rituals? He was giving me the tools of dissociation. I've heard of a mom who had her 2 and 4-year-olds disclosing SRA to her. And she said her daughter told her, Mommy, don't worry, God takes me to heaven when they hurt me. God is there to protect us, hold our hand. I had a survivor say, I saw Jesus' sandaled foot in the water where they had me drowning. You know, he was right there. It's like, because of free will, he doesn't stop it, right? And the way I understand that the best is the way that God wanted it created was Eden, where he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they had all the animals and all the trees, and they weren't eating any other animals, or nothing was getting killed. And it was just perfection. And, you know, talking to God, Adam would walk with God in the garden, and, you know, they were happy. And then the devil came in and tricked them into eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So because they chose to go against God's rule to them, don't eat from that tree. You can eat all the other trees, don't eat that one. The devil came in, tricked them, because God gave them free will, because God does not want us to be robots, which I'm glad. You know, I'm not glad because what my parents chose, but because of that, the devil was allowed to come in and bring his destruction with it. So there's a lot of stuff we don't understand in the process of that, and we're not going to understand it down here. But God is a good God, and he wants good things for me, and I trust him in that completely. And I know that whenever there's evil, that the devil's connected to it, and that I don't want anything to do with that. So do you see the very fine line of demarcation I have between the two of them? It's night and day for me, which for me, and not all SRA survivors see it the way I do, but that's how simple it was for me. So that's how I can trust God and know that he's the good guy, and I know who the bad guy is, and I keep that straight. And he knew too, like, I'm a grandma now. I mean, I was able to raise my kids. I homeschooled my kids all the way through high school. You know, they've gone on to college and have businesses and they're doing well. A couple of my kids are married. My third grandchild is on its way. God saw me to this point. I didn't see it. So when I was struggling to heal, I was crying. I like crying on the couch day after day. My poor kids, day after day. Some days literally crawling into the kitchen to get them a piece of bread for lunch. I mean, I wasn't able to do much for them. And it's like, God, why am I here? I don't want to be here. This is too hard for me. They would do better with somebody else, right? But God saw me to where I am today. And so he has to walk us through. He had to walk me through all those rituals. It would have been so much easier to die in a ritual. I cannot tell you how much easier. And I still say the lucky ones die in the rituals. It might sound really awful to say that, but living through those rituals and being re-victimized over and over again is a horror I can't explain. Healing from it is a horror I cannot explain. But even there, God, he's like, okay, I need to get them through till I can get them healing. Then I need to get them through the healing till I can get them to the other side. And there does come a point where you can live life and you can find that joy again. And I can't say that I don't have PTSD meltdowns, because I still do. And I still end up in the closet with my back against the corner, just terrified. And, you know, my husband or kids come and it's like, don't touch me, you know, get away, sort of stuff. I still go there. But most of the time I'm at peace and I'm really enjoying the life that God has given me. And only God can do that. I mean, that's the power of God. With what I've been through to be able to get here, it's nothing but a miracle.
Nothing but a
And
miracle. You
yeah,
inspired me so much, the strength that you and other survivors have. And like you said, you have a podcast now, and I'd love to talk about that and for you to touch on that. What motivated you to do that? Because I think it's so refreshing to see podcast material from your non-traditional podcast hosts instead of somebody that's saying, hey, I run a multi-million-dollar business and I'm ultra successful and I have a private jet. You know, it's a very different image, and even the people that you're bringing on. And I'd love to hear, because I know for me, I haven't dealt with any level of trauma even comparable to what you and other survivors have. And it's hard for me to talk about some of the things that I've went through, you know, and I look at somebody like you and the strength that you and other survivors have. And all I can think is I choke over my own words talking about the things that I've went through, and they're not even nearly as traumatic as you have. How did you come to terms with your own bravery and your own courage to, for one, start a podcast? And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it, but I want to use this opportunity also. What advice would you give survivors who might want to talk, or who are going through something and who really, they're losing faith in the fact that maybe they can't or they never could talk about it?
well, being able to talk about it is not something every survivor can do. So, you know, when you have, as an SRA survivor, having a podcast, I love it because I can speak for everybody. I can't speak that I have the same experience of everybody or that I reacted the same way as everybody. And we all have completely different ways we heal. There's no two survivors that are going to heal in even near the same way. But I can speak for all of us. And I've had some Facebook groups that are closed and for Christian survivors of SRA and through the years. And they always say, Lisa, go speak for us. Go tell them they need to know this. And I love to be able to do that because God's somehow enabled me to be able to talk about it. I don't know why and I don't know how, but he really laid it on my heart to educate society about SRA. And I really want to do that. So I wrote the book and I tried going to churches saying, would you let me come and give my testimony? And you're like, oh, no way. You know, we don't want you talking about that in the church, right? Which I could go on forever about that, and I won't. But my pastor of our church now, my husband and I went, I gave him the book. He read it, bless his heart. And he said, Lisa, would you give a 15-minute testimony at church? And it's like, at our church? You want me to come speak at our church? And so he let me in. I said, well, what parameters do you want me to speak? And he's like, there are no parameters. You just say what God leads you to say. And he read my book, so he knows how bad it is, right? He knows what SRA is. He understands it. So I started the speech with, I killed a dead man. And everybody just stopped breathing and stared at me. And I really don't think they breathed for about 5 minutes. I kind of wanted to say, okay, everybody stop. I'm sorry, just take a breath. And I promise we're going to end up someplace good in this. But they responded incredibly well. They came up, they were so happy. You know, God was so good. People came up with stories of bad things that had happened to them they had never told anybody because they didn't think anybody would ever understand it. They said, you told me your story, I know you'll get it. And I can absorb those stories. I can understand them because of what I've been through. So, you know, I'm willing to, I go, I will speak, I will tell my story, I will tell the stories of other people. And so now some of the people are coming alongside and saying, okay, I can talk on your podcast. And so we're slowly getting survivors. Some of them will, and then the last minute they pull out because of panic attacks. And, you know, you got to be careful that they have people around them so that there's not suicide programming that gets triggered. And it's a tricky, tricky business talking to SRA survivors, especially the first time. Like I had John Smith on, real lovely man, and that was his first time speaking, and he did such a brave job. He did a great job. And Charisse Milan I had on, and she wrote a book called For the Silenced Ones, and she's out there also advocating for all the ones that died, even that, you know, are the kids that are still being hurt today. We can speak for them. We can talk about what's going on. Samantha Baldwin came on and shared her heroic struggle with her boys that were taken away from her and given to her ex-husband who was abusing them in SRA. Just horrendous stories, very horrible stories. And people are coming and they're sharing it with us. And, you know, I can converse with it because I understand it. You know, I understand what they're going through. I get, you know, I know what questions to ask, and it makes it easy. But I didn't know how to do a podcast. I never even listened to a podcast. Like I'd given one interview once for a podcast, but I'd never heard them before. So I'd given an interview last fall. My husband and I went to a church back up in Michigan, actually the same place where I was abused. And so it was like 4 1-hour interviews. And I started getting contacted by some people because of those interviews. And one lady contacted me, a good friend now, Monique, and she said, would you come on my podcast and talk about SRA? So I got to go and do that. And then she's like, Lisa, you need to do a podcast. I'm like, whoa, what? She goes, you need to have a podcast. And I'm like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. And I went and prayed about it. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. So she's like, you just get this anchor and you call them and you push the button and they get on and they push their button and then you just have a podcast going. And so that was kind of a very easy way to start it. But it's, you know, I don't pay any money for it. You know, I don't get any money for it. It's just to get survivors and also to educate. You know, I've had Patricia Clark come out. She's a minister and she started ministering to SRA survivors because they started showing up at her door. She didn't know what to do with them, so she just started ministering to them. She makes it sound so easy, which is funny. She wrote Sanctification in Reverse, The Essence of Satanic Ritual Abuse, which is a great, gave me the most clear understanding of what the demonic is doing, what God's doing, how they go in the opposite directions, and really help me understand a lot of it. So it's just kind of pieces that started coming together. So doing the podcast is hard, you know, again, you know how that is. You're absorbing the stories as people tell them, but they're honoring you by being willing to speak about the unspeakable things. And that society is listening. I am just thrilled.
What's been
thrilled.
I know you've had so many, including myself, I've learned so much from it, and I know you're giving a platform to very silenced topics and voices. On the contrary, have you been met with any resistance? What have your parents said, and what's been the relationship on the other side of people who were involved in your abuse and in the cult?
It's actually been pretty silent. Periodically, I'll have, like in January, I had a couple uncles kind of giving me some hassles. That was unpleasant, but I was able to deal with it and block them from pages. And you know, they had done a bad review on Amazon and terrified me because I knew it was somebody speaking directly to me, and it wasn't somebody that had information from the book. So I figured out this has to be an uncle of mine, and I have a lot of them. And my daughter was able to go and do some research and figured out that it's like, so, stuff like that's terrifying to me because it's like, oh no, now what are they going to do? But, um, really, I've been in a very protective bubble that I've really appreciated. And like, um, a lot of the people that were involved in the cult are now in their 70s and 80s. So, that brings a level of safety now. My father had a severe stroke several years ago, about, I think, the year my book came out, because I was worried about him suing me, although I don't name him in the story, but because my name's on the book, anybody could research, figure out who he was, but, we didn't have any problems with that. And now, even if somebody tried to muzzle me, I'm out there in so many places. My story's out there. They can't stop it anymore, which makes me really, really happy. Because I had such this drive when I was writing this book. I just have to get it out. And I self-published it. I got to get it out so they can't silence me. And so once it was out, it's just such a relief. It's like they can't ever take it back now.
And I think that's really inspiring for people, any person on any level of trauma, and especially survivors who can talk about it but are very reserved. I always think that the thing that connects us most as humans isn't this picture perfect perception that we go on Instagram and scroll through. It's really these human experiences that somebody else says, "Me too. I went through that too," or "I went through something similar," or "I can't comprehend going through that. How can I be here for you?" Or "I know somebody else that went through that." And I think it's really incredible seeing you and countless other survivors finding each other through all the rubble of censorship and this craziness that we're dealing with online platforms, dealing with big tech. I think it's phenomenal. There's this army forming of people like you coming forth and saying, "I'm not scared anymore. I'm in a safe space to tell my story, and I'm going to." And then it gives somebody else strength to do it, which gives somebody else strength to do it. And now there's this whole network of survivors that are talking, meeting, sharing stories. And I really do think there's strength in that. I really do think that if you are in a place and you're comfortable telling your story, you might just be scared about what other people are going to say. Nobody, unless you are an abuser, nobody hears a story of what a child has gone through and wants you to feel shamed for it. They want to take that away from you, and they want to figure out how to make it better. And you end up realizing that you're not alone, and I think that that's something that's so important that so many survivors have said, including you, that I felt so alone in my journey, not telling anybody. You don't hear about these stories. So I thought I was the only one that had gone through it, and it made me feel crazy and that I couldn't talk to people. And when you realize that it's something that is happening globally in our very own communities, it brings almost to the sense of unity to survivors. And then on the contrary, to people like me, it creates this army of activists that can stand next to you and say, "I hear you too, and I'm going to share what you have to say, and I'm going to protect you," right? And I do that all the time on my page. I get bullies from that know survivors that come on my page and write these horrible comments, and I block them right away, or I tell them off, right? And I know that that's so powerful to have censorship working the other way, where we're saying, "No, you can come at me all you want. You can come after one survivor. You can come after one activist. But what happens when there's 100 of us? What happens when there's 1,000 of us? What happens when there's a million of us?" And I really, I think it's amazing seeing the army that you're creating and the people that you're bringing together, because the more people that we can bring into this, and the more that this gets shared and that people listen and they do take measures to go follow your podcast and listen to your guests to learn more, right? Who says personal development has to be all butterflies and rainbows all the time? This has been the biggest personal development couple years of my life. And most of the information I've been consuming isn't this positive, almost toxicity that floods us with what we're supposed to learn. I think this information is just as important. And it's like you said, people in the cult, they know more about God and Jesus than most people that aren't. And because of that, they're able to get away with what they do because they're so good at using their enemies' information against them. And I think from our perspective, we don't have to learn to be interested in partaking. It's how do we combat the enemy better than the enemy can combat us? What do we need to do? And our best tools is to learn what the enemy does from survivors like you who can provide us that information.
Thank you. I'm just thrilled hearing you say that. It just really does my heart good.
It's incredible. I'm so honored to have you here. And the thing I love about you is you're using your story in a really positive way. So what's on the horizon for you? You started a podcast. What's your goal with your podcast, and what can people look forward to, and where can they also get your book?
My book's on Amazon. It can be found at Barnes & Noble online. It's in Kindle. And I really don't know with the podcast. I just, wherever God wants to take it, I will get all the survivors on I can. I will get all the information out about it that I can. And I've got some moms coming on this week who are going to give some really hard stories. And, we got to find a way to get these moms who's got their exes involved in SRA and have custodial parenting going on to get those kids away from them. Something's going on in family court system, that's just got to be changed. The judges can make these arbitrary decisions and not back them up. And it's giving the cult too much power. And the moms and the poor kids, it's just breaking my heart. It makes it, I'm speaking, I've got a church the end of June I'm going to be speaking at, so doors are finally starting to open there, which I'm really thrilled with, because actually a lot of these cult members are in the churches. A lot of pastors. My dad was a worship leader. He was a teen Sunday school teacher. He gets on school boards. He just knows how to work, these systems. So also, who believes a good church going family would be involved in that, right? So it's a really, really good cover for them. So, my goal is the complete exposure of satanic ritual abuse. And I'm just going to keep pushing towards that. And I think we can do it. I think this is the time with the internet, with the podcast, with people like you're a hero to me because you come alongside us and you're giving us a voice and you're giving us a platform and you're getting us followers and saying, hey, go listen to these stories. It's heroic what you're doing because other people aren't doing it. So let's get more people like you and let's all start pulling together. Samantha Baldwin and Samantha Brown in the UK, they're doing marches for SRA and for child sex trafficking and pedophilia. It's like we need to do that in America. Let's join them and pull together and pull resources and force the society to wake up and to listen, because the media is not going to cover it. Fox News and CNN is not going to cover it. Let's keep going through these channels. And I'm just, Epstein really shows you how corrupt things are and how long it took them to expose Epstein, but he was exposed. And there's a really interesting passage in Jeremiah in the Old Testament. There was a place called the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. And that's where they went to sacrifice their kids on the altars of Baal and Molech. And God sent a prophet there named Jeremiah to that valley. And he was talking about the depravities. And he had a listing of them. And the last one he listed was satanic ritual abuse. And he was talking about God exposing. Well, all the other abuses have been exposed publicly. This is the last one. So I really believe that God has been systematically exposing. We've had the Catholic Church scandal. People used to not believe that dads sexually abuse their kids or moms are sexually abusing their kids. That's come out. Lately it's been sex trafficking. Thank God, finally. And now SRA is the last holdout. So we're exposing that. And I know God's in it, and I'm excited just to be a part of it.
Well, we're
And
lucky
you
to
are part of
have you
it.
in the way, girl. It's really refreshing for me to see people talking about it too, because it's hard filtering out information on it. And like you said, what books and resources are there? There's very few, so it's nice to be able to access this information, unfortunately, from people who have experienced it, but what a gift that you're giving everybody else to learn about it. Now, where can people connect with you online if they want to keep in touch with you or find you? Because you're on a couple platforms.
So, Only God Rescued Me, My Journey from Satanic Ritual Abuse is the title of my book. And then I've kept that in Instagram, Facebook, so that people can find me. Trying to start Twitter, but I'm not real good at this yet. So it might be a little while before I get that going. So, if you Google Only God Rescued Me, hopefully you'll start finding Lisa Meister. You'll start coming to my podcast. I'm on all the platforms. And come please find me on Instagram or on Facebook and leave comments. Let me know what you're thinking, how you're reacting. I would love to interact, or questions that you would like me to cover. I would love to answer the questions, because I know there's a lot of really good questions that people have, and I'm not going to be able to know what all of them are. So if people can come and find me and share them with me, direct message me. I respond to survivors, survivors who want to speak. Reach out to me. John Smith came on. He just reached out to me. Can I come and speak on your podcast? So I talked to him, went back and forth. It's like, yes, I would love to have you. So, I'm just thrilled, just very thrilled. So anybody who wants to find me there, that's how to find me.
And you guys, please connect with Lisa. Like she said, she's very vocal and responsive. I had no trouble at all. I was a complete stranger to her until we started chatting on social media, and she responded to me right away. And that's the thing. These are very influential people who want to teach you, and they want to communicate with you, and they want platforms to have their voices heard, and they want to feature you. They want you to be able to feel free to share your story too. So I'm going to link all of Lisa's information below. Don't be surprised if Lisa's on again. I think she has so much information to offer. I really wanted to cover her story today, but as you guys heard from her story, there's so many different parts of it that we could dive a little bit deeper into. So, Lisa, you're absolutely invited to come on again, and I'd love to share more of the insight that you have. But thank you so much for being here with us here today, and just for the courage that you have to step up and educate people, even though there's the benefit for you outweighs the benefit of not talking. I can't imagine how hard it is still just to talk about what you've gone through. So I just want to commend you for being able to stand here strong today and use your voice to educate people like me and everybody listening on these very real things that we don't hear about in mainstream media.
Well, thank you so much. I was so honored to be here. I can't tell you. Thank you again for what you're doing.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you want to say, or anything that you want to leave with people before we hop off today?
The whole purpose of everything I do is that God is good. And I just thank him for healing me and getting me through. And I thank him for that he's there for each and every one of us.
So beautiful. What a perfect note to leave on. Well, you guys, hit subscribe, share this episode far and wide. Please share survivor stories, enlighten other people. Sometimes that's all it takes, is a seed planted. Tag us on social media, connect with us. And until next time, you guys, join us on the next episode of The Imagination. Connect with Lisa. And Lisa, thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you too. And everybody, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.